with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers for our next panel, and I'm going to start with Sonal Patel, who is going to moderate our panel that is Innovation to Deliver Reliable Transition. Sonal has spent the last 15 years as senior associate at Power Magazine, which I learned last night is 140 years old, if I remember right, which is amazing to me. And she covers news on the global scale power sector. Previously, Sonal worked doing technical writing in Houston and as a freelance writer at BP. She graduated from the University of Houston with a degree in English and journalism and has won a lot of awards, since plethora is a word I wouldn't normally use, since stepping into her current role, including a number of editorial excellence awards at Power Magazine, and we are delighted to have her moderate our panel today. Our first panelist today is Jake Loosararian. He's co-founder and CEO of Gecko Robotics. And if you are a regular listener to the EPSA podcast, which I'm sure at least some of you are, Jake was on our podcast in the fall and did a great job of explaining what Gecko does. Gecko, with its wall-climbing robots, can collect data millions of times more efficiently and much more safely than a human can, and is a great example of innovation and technology that can help assure system reliability. Prior to founding the company, which put him on Hive Ventures 30 Under 30, as well as a feature in Forbes magazine, Jake worked as an engineer at Rovisys? I never get that right. After graduating from Grove City College, our joint alma mater, where he earned a degree in engineering, and that's where he did the prototype for his Gecko robot, was at Grove City. Next is Shawn Bennett. Shawn is the Energy and Resilience Division Manager at Battelle, and he'll have a great line about Patel not being Mattel or the other company that I can't remember. Shawn's devoted his career to energy, having worked as the Director of Strategic Communications and then a Managing Director at FTI Consulting, as well as the Executive Vice President at the Ohio Oil and Gas Association and at the U.S. Department of Energy, where he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oil and Gas. And Shawn graduated from from Ohio University.
Thank you.
In 2003. Finally on this panel, we have the co-founder of Imperium Predictive Analytics, Lucas Grimes. Lucas used his knowledge of computer science to learn more about the U.S. restructured energy market and develop solutions to its problems through innovation. Prior to founding Imperium, Lucas worked as a consultant at Aspen Energy, and before that helped lead college students to business success as branch manager at the Young Entrepreneurs of America. Lucas, unlike Shawn, graduated from The Ohio State University with a degree in neuroscience. So during the panel, if I get it right this time, you'll be able to submit questions that we can bring up to Sonal so that she can ask them if we have time, and the questions will be anonymous if that's important to you. So I would ask you to join me in welcoming our panelists, and Sonal, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you. So in this session, we're going to explore technology's role in ensuring reliability in the complex landscape that we're facing here. And I think what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about existing technologies and how future technologies will fit into the landscape, and also some of the challenges and including costs, for example. I think what I really wanted to start off with was, Power Magazine is a really old magazine, and for the most part, we've been focused on inside the fence type of technology. But as operations become more complex, we start to see a lot more. We have to start to understand how technology plays into the overall picture. So I really want to ask you, begin the conversation with, how do you view technology? Are you optimistic about technology, and how do you feel about technology solving reliability problems today? I guess maybe let's start with Lucas.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm extremely optimistic. It's a very interesting time to be in AI in general. I'm sure all of us hear about ChatGPT and all the things that they're doing in this field, which is very interesting. Energy has a lot of challenges, but challenges are fun for engineers, and energy is extremely data rich, which is great for AI, so I'm optimistic as far as a data science perspective is concerned.
Fantastic. How about you, Jake?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Quickly on Gecko, we're maybe background so you can understand my advantage. We work on accelerating digitization using robotics to collect data and then using software to inform from what the data is telling us about the physical environment, the built world. The background I have is was from DC, bootstrapped a company here actually in Pittsburgh, and then went out to Silicon Valley to build Gecko, and then actually came back after 6 months and getting first round of funding to Pittsburgh, and actually worked with a group called RIPA in Pennsylvania in the power sector. So independent power producers were, kind of where we started. Since then, raised about 130 to fuel innovation into the power sector and a little bit beyond. Am I optimistic? I think there is plenty to be optimistic for, but I break it into two categories. One category is optimistic about future promise of new inventions that are maybe a decade away, and then what can help us today. I'm mostly focused on what can work and help today in relation to robotics and digitization tools, AI. And I think I see way fewer companies and ability to break through into very large and very established companies. It's hard to break into these industries, and I kind of view it very similar to our work in the government in some ways, because the barrier to entry can be very high. I think power is actually the quickest barrier to entry for companies that are trying to integrate technology, opposed to are working in oil and gas or working in government. So I think we need to. There's a lot of faux innovation that's happening that is fueled by innovation teams, and I think that can create an illusion of lots of innovation in this space, but then the innovation doesn't build from there. So yes, I'm optimistic in the potential of technology. I am actually pretty pessimistic on how we're doing as it relates to speed of adopting that innovation. We still use practices in the 70s and 80s to maintain the most important infrastructure that powers our entire world. Digitization has not taken over in the power sector. So yeah, I'm pessimistic in some ways, optimistic about what it can do, though.
How about you, Shawn? Tell us about Battelle and what they...
I'm an eternal optimist. And again, that's where you have to be, right? And it is that balance, right? So you have the private sector that has to meet the needs of the customers, yet you have the regulatory initiatives that are put in place that you have to meet, right? And so it is a balance in that of, I have to put together a project that is not only going to be economic, but I have to know it's going to pass the muster of what current regulators want, but future regulators as well. And so you have to kind of look at it through that lens. And, again, now I feel like I have to tell my joke that Todd wanted to set me up for. And again, at Patel, which is not to be confused with Mattel, because everybody thinks I make Barbies or race cars, or Battelle, who is an EPC. We live in that kind of R&D space. And again, that's primarily fueled by, Department of Energy and really Congress and the administration itself. And, it is recognizing that there is that valley of death. No matter where you're at in the innovation space, you always have to strive to get better. But if you're looking at your ratepayer, you can't justify that by going to them. So you need that government funding to help you, kind of usher you along into getting better. And so, I think, again, bipartisan infrastructure law or, just programmatic dollars that come out of Congress, they're there for companies to take advantage of, and it keeps you on the forefront. And there are those who choose not to do it, and there are those who are very, very aggressive in making sure they do it. And, it's interesting when you think about government funding and innovation. When you go for government funding, and I think this is kind of the disconnect that I think a lot of people have, is that they want to make money off innovation. And that happens the third or fourth plant that you build, but it doesn't happen on the first. And you have to make that commitment, and you have to make that ask to your shareholders or whoever of recognizing that the DOE is there to make sure that you can get the funding needed to progress, but you're not going to essentially hit it home run every time. And you have to make those investments early, because ultimately everybody's going to be in the same boat. And you can ignore it. And again, there have been plenty of public utilities who have ignored it. But you have to start making that investment early, because ultimately it's all going to catch up. And that's just the reality of where we're at today.
Okay. I mean, it's a good point to bring up, and I think Rob underscored the pace of change that it is a huge challenge. I wonder if, you know, are there any specific technologies that you would highlight that are addressing reliability problems today? Maybe even from the granular plant level. Maybe Jake, you have some insight on that.
Yeah, well, Gecko Robotics is helping, I think, with this. So I can speak maybe to an example of where our company's technology has aided, and then I can maybe comment on some other technologies that I see being very useful, if that's okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think where this started, my journey started in 2013. We're basically an independent power producer in northwestern Pennsylvania, was having 40% of the year shutdowns. And back then, the best way to stop a thing from breaking was to send a human in, collect as much data as they can on the structural integrity, and then be able to make a decision on the reliability of that unit. And then that just consistently didn't work, and actually someone had died doing the inspection the year before. So I built a wall-calling robot that could solve that problem, and took them from 40% of the year having outages when they didn't want to zero. So that's an example of where technology can help accelerate, and that's accelerated now to doing that at the largest utilities in the U.S., and then on the refinery side and manufacturing side. So I think this is where it's hard to believe that technology can affect and change large industries unless you can see it happening at the ground level. And then you have to be able to connect the dots between how does the thing that we're solving at like the facility level, the power plant level, how is that actually helping me, with my E4 metrics? How is it helping me with my reliability and sustainability metrics? Like the things that connect the dots between the technology and what you have to charge for these like tools, these new developments, AI, robotics, whatever. I think to go back to your previous question, like why I'm realistic about the impact I see with technology is the models that venture capital, and I know the results from the poll was, it should be private-backed funding. The returns for venture capital have to be like very large. If you're not having a $500 million or above exit, then you're not worth betting on. And so like that's like really hard to adopt in the energy sector, for example, and why you see less innovation in the energy sector from tech companies is because the returns are not as great, and the predictability about what the environment's going to look like, from a regulation standpoint, is very unpredictable. So anyway, I think that's why there's some stifling. But you have to be able to show a connection between what's going on, how the technology can actually impact an executive's decision, and why, for example, creating digital twins of their assets is an important thing to do. Other technology I see that is doing this and approach this in impactful ways. I think Palantir has done a pretty interesting job at trying to impact, taking a bunch of disparate data sets and trying to make them more useful. My friend who's the CTO and now board member at Siemens Energy always tells me that we collect more data than any other industry in the energy sector. We only know how to use about a little bit less than 1% of it usefully. So I think big companies like Siemens Energy can identify these things. It's up to companies that are trying to integrate new technology, startups, to be able to be agile enough and targeted enough to show impact and change, and how that can lead to transformative ways of reinventing or new models, business models for energy companies. But there's not enough shots being taken in the energy sector. And I think part of the reason is connecting the dots between how a robot at a power plant can impact the decision of a CEO. So that's what we're focused on. But yeah, it's not intuitive.
Lucas, do you have any insight on that and how,
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said. When I started Imperium, it was funny because I came in as a broker, but I came from a very analytical background academically, and it was phone, fax, and email at this broker shop in 2018 or whatever year it was, and I just kept asking questions. Well, why are we calling them today? Just make your 90 calls, make your 90 calls. I'm like, okay. What moves the price action? Just read the script, read the script. So, that's kind of like a good first kind of insight into slow adoption of any kind of technology. It was phone, fax, and email, in the 21st century, and I just saw it was a machine learning SaaS play all over it. So I thought that was very interesting. So that was the impetus to kind of get into energy. But as to adoption, it needs to be quicker. We need to see what works, and then we need to scale it. Simple as that.
Where do you see the constraints of time? Shawn, do you see where are the biggest challenges when we talk about adoption of technology?
It's a great question. There's the political role and there's the reality.
Right.
And that is a very difficult line to kind of straddle. If you go back to the bipartisan infrastructure law or even the IRA, are there incentives that make things start to make sense? And that answer is yes. Is it commercial? And that answer is vehemently no, right? I think Lucas and I were talking here last night. The reality is I think after the bipartisan infrastructure law, it reminded me of George Bush being on the freight carrier with mission accomplished behind him, and that was a lie. And that is where we have to recognize that we're at. We started a great conversation. It's going to take a lot of work to get there, but the fact that we started the conversation is very important. And we set forth a lot of programmatic funding to make things start to make sense. And once you start doing those things, ultimately, there are going to be more questions that need to be answered. And I think, in some people's minds, that we answered all the questions and it was ready to set, go. And that is just not true. And that's very important, that kind of frame that we have to think about, is that we started getting all of you in the room to start thinking about how are we going to do it. And then we're going to start feed studies, we're going to start doing a lot of the innovation that needs to be done. And it wouldn't have been done without government funding. That's the reality. I hate to poo-poo on the survey that was here earlier. But everybody here has to have a return on their investment because that's what makes economic sense. But to give that little nudge to start thinking about, okay, I can start implementing this, and again, going back to my earlier answer, you're not making money off the first one. Nobody makes money off the first one. But you're starting the conversation, you're going to get better, and you're going to become more succinct, and you're going to make it more economic. Then it starts to make more sense. And so, right now you have to think about, I'm going to make these investments, and these are investments that are going to ultimately lead into a more profitable model, and not profitable as far as earnings, but economic, to where you're not losing money on innovating and making sure that you're staying in line with the regulatory structure.
Yes, we had a really interesting conversation about the potential of hydrogen power, for example. Would you talk a little bit about, is that an example of how a technology that is seen as potential, with potential, but has implications for how quickly we can roll it out efficiently. What are your thoughts on that?
Oof, that's a loaded question. There's a company line and there's my line, right? And the reality is, when you think about hydrogen, and I applaud the administration, I applaud Congress for really investing in that. And again, it makes sense in a lot of use cases. It's finding the right use cases. And I think that is where a lot of people detract from, the purpose of hydrogen. When I think about hydrogen in itself, and again, it is for what can't be electrified. And a lot of people are trying to fit it into what can be. And I think that's the problem there, right? It is finding those use cases that make sense. And it's, again, a difficult question to answer because we needed that funding to make it work. But hydrogen serves a place, and again, from an emissions standpoint, if we can start blending that into the mixture, what does that look like? However, that creates a lot of other questions. How much hydrogen can you put into a pipeline? And what pipelines make sense? And how close to the pipeline do you have to be from where you're actually doing the blending, and so forth. But again, I think the interesting thing about hydrogen, again, it's a fascinating energy deliverer. Is that I always think about color wars. You have 1, 2, 3, 4. I declare a color war, and it somehow becomes like a sorority issue. Because you have green hydrogen, you have blue hydrogen, you have pink hydrogen, and they're all at odds. And you sit there and you kind of take a step back and you think, why are you fighting with one another when it's ultimately the energy carrier that you need? And you need blue hydrogen because ultimately that's the lowest cost hydrogen that you'll ever be able to create. And if you create the hydrogen network and you create the delivery systems and the consumption, ultimately, in a perfect world, green hydrogen will become cheap enough to be able to be delivered. But yet there are those who want to stop blue hydrogen from happening because it's not their chosen hydrogen. And to me, I find that strange because hydrogen is just a molecule. And whether it's green, blue, or pink is what makes sense. And if you can actually make an economy based on hydrogen, the green hydrogen is ultimately going to be able to compete. You just have to create the economy. And the blue hydrogen is what's going to make people start going into the hydrogen economy. And then ultimately, I don't know the time frame there, green hydrogen will be able to fill in the gaps. But if you stop it at, I don't like blue hydrogen, you don't allow a hydrogen economy to take place and start getting into that market.
So you're saying we have to have more of a neutral way of looking at, assessing technology and adopting it.
What is the old saying? The art of the perfect gets in the way of progress, or whatever it is. And that's the problem, right? Everybody wants to get to where they want to be, but they don't think about the progress it takes to get there. And if you start delving into pink hydrogen, and again, 45V with pink hydrogen is an amazing tax benefit that's probably going to be more economic than blue in some scenarios. But you have to start that conversation, and then ultimately it will start blending in. But at the end of the day, again, it's blending natural gas with hydrogen. I think we had this conversation last night at dinner, is the reality of, will hydrogen become cheaper than natural gas? And today, you kind of sit there and think, well, no, it takes it takes natural gas to make hydrogen. So you not only need the MMBTU of natural gas to go into hydrogen and then ultimately create it. But then you also have to go through the energy process to make it happen. So ultimately, natural gas is a far better solution. And then that gets into, do you need carbon capture, do you need hydrogen? And I'm sure that's another question we'll have down the line. But, again, you have to sit there and start balancing that. You have to start, it's one bite at a time. And that's the way we get there.
We'll get to the economics, I promise. I really, I think one of the things that we look at, and viewing it from the supply side, but we are looking at this massive ramp up in electrification, the implications for demand, and how we're going to supply that. I think it becomes a huge driver. Todd was talking about record highs that the EIA was projecting last year or this year, and the initiatives that are underway to implement electrification. So, I don't know that we have a specific number for what we should be catering our supply, or at least trying to achieve that balance between supply and demand. I wondered, because that has huge implications for reliability. So I think, Lucas, I wonder if you have some insight on forecasting.
Yeah.
And how reliable is forecasting? What are some surprising elements of forecasting? Maybe you can
Sure.
shed some light on.
Yeah, so as Jake alluded to, we have so much data in this industry, it's ridiculous. But it's not actionable for most people. There's so many use cases for it. And it's extremely robust because there are so many indexes that help to correlate. They help to work together to predict, like, say, if you're using weather, LMP, congestion, marginal loss, those kinds of things in conjunction. They're very good at forecasting LMP prices. Your time horizons are different, so if you're looking at maybe, which is a lot of what we do, is optimized procurement strategies, you're looking more at historicals. We've got 30 plus years of data in the market that we use on that. That's all weather, historicals, and again, LMP and other market features. So that's good for if you're looking at anything from a month to 12 months out. If you're looking at higher velocity decision making, that would also be good for say, capacity markets that are a little bit more dynamic. As opposed to every 36 months having an auction, you had something a little bit more impromptu that you can kind of scale with your demand. If you're looking at higher velocity decision making, whether that's a generation asset bidding into the real-time or day-ahead markets, you're looking at your limiting reagents, usually going to be weather. All know we probably look at a weather forecast and we say yay to ourselves when it says 78 and sunny next week, but then it turns out to be 30 degrees. That might just be an Ohio thing.
It's a Tuesday.
Yeah. But in any case, that's usually your limiting reagent on sort of the higher velocity, what would revolve around higher velocity decision making. So load balancing would be another great use case there. I'm not here to say a lot of AI guys will go on and they'll say it's a crystal ball, it's clairvoyant, it's the be all end all. But I will say this: we don't have to contend with say take financial markets which their forecasting models that are very high frequency have gotten very good. It's like having a house edge. They're not perfect, but you're not going to find a bank or a major fund these days that doesn't use them. It doesn't have at least one quantitative arm to their company. Retail traders are getting pretty beat up in the intraday markets just because it's tough out there competing against these high frequency guys. But that's just a testament to how robust these things are coming. And the price action in financial markets is the money-weighted sum of human psychology, whereas with energy, it's mostly driven by physics. The physical components that coordinate together to make up the physical grid, and then the forces that act on the grid in the form of weather and other things. But human sentiment doesn't come so much into it unless you're talking policy.
When we talk about the incentives that are starting to prop up at least or make some technologies look feasible. I wonder if can we talk about how we're going to implement them into the larger system, given market constraints? We have, queues, we have permitting issues. How do you think that all plays into the time frame? Because essentially, we have we have less, 2030 is many folks' targets for how we can integrate some of these decarbonized technologies. So how do you see market challenges affecting this?
There's permitting issues? You don't say. It's a great question, right? And I don't think anybody has that answer. There are permitting issues. There are regulatory issues. We're still waiting for Treasury guidance on 45V and what that actually looks like for implementing hydrogen. And then you have, again, the reality, especially for power gen, CCS is going to be a necessary thing that you have to have. And the permits aren't getting done quick enough. And then you have primacy and, that states are trying to go for, and what does that look like? And then you're a race against the clock, right? For natural gas power gen, CCS is probably the best answer to try to get to remaining in line with current and future aspirations for, carbon emission reduction. But it's all about geology. It's all about economics. And then thirdly, it's all about permitting and making sure that you're able to put that all together. And that's very important. What I fear ever happening is that carbon capture gets caught in the same lens as almost natural gas pipeline permitting, where a great idea goes away because the cost of compliance is so extreme. And you have to make it all make sense. And again, there's also the caveat of there's a lot of natural gas plants that are above bad geology. And that's just something that we have to be cognizant of. And how do you start making it all work? And until you start making that market, which I do believe 45Q started to make that case when they increased the rates, is it enough for everyone to comply? No. I think it does have to be higher for everyone to start getting into that compliance, but it is a good start to start that conversation. And once you start that conversation and people are able to start justifying the parasitic load of carbon capture technology on a natural gas power plant, then you can start making the case for future cases and then increasing the rate to make it make sense. Because at the end of the day, you can have the carrot or the stick, but companies have to make that justification to their board or the ratepayers or the state or whoever that may be, that it does make sense to start doing carbon capture technology on their plants and deliver a low cost and reliable power system to their customers.
Do you think specifically that is it going to, when we talk about some of these technologies that are emerging, for example, advanced nuclear, and we talked about hydrogen, we've talked a little bit about carbon capture. There's also long duration storage that we saw up there that's still under development. That's and being incentivized. And there's a lot of research and development that's ongoing. But in a competitive market, we talk about costs and economic viability. I think that has implications for how quickly there are, or at least what the widespread adoption rate is of any one technology. I wonder, how do you see these emerging technologies thriving in competitive markets? We need them because of decarbonization. We know that they have potential, but is there going to be, are competitive markets just going to be slower at adopting some of these technologies? For example, advanced nuclear. What role is the competitive market going to have to play in this adoption? How about Jake? Why don't you take that?
Yeah, well, look, I know we're focusing on reliability here. And I think reliability with technologies by technologies, I'm referring to how you're talking about power sources and fuel sources that are coming, right? But I think in particular, what's interesting is what's happening right now, because the environment will completely change if our grid becomes more and more unreliable. And so I think that's the important thing to focus on right now. That's the thing that, that's kind of, that's why we're here. I think the thing is, as we continue to take more and more power plants offline, and we stress the grid more and more, the question now starts to become, when you want a power source to be reliable and turn on and work the way you want it to, will it? And what I can tell is, whether it be through the increased amounts of blackouts doubling from 2015 to 2020, whether it be the increased pool and amount of energy that we use, whether it be because of just increasing the amount of electric vehicles we have, which are going to continue to drive up the strain on the grid. This question is very important. And as we add renewables, we have to make sure that we have very flexible thermal units. So being able to cycle and turn on and off is very important. However, we aren't exactly sure what's going to happen as it relates to the reliability of those structures as we begin to do those sort of things. So that's a big concern for me, is the amount of cycling we are doing and stressing on facilities that were never really designed to turn on and off all the time, whether it's converting a coal plant to a natural gas site, for example. This thermal fatigue on structures is that's a big concern to me. And it's something that we as an industry have just always been, and this is true for any built environment today, we've always been so reactive. And that's just simply because the technology has not existed for us to be something other than reactive. And so in my humble opinion, when we talk about reliability, predictability is the only way to have reliability. And so that's what the focus should be on for technology companies that are looking to push reliability and increase reliability, but actually have that reliability be measured. We have to be able to understand the impact of cycling units and having flexible assets, what kind of effects that has on the reliability of those units when called upon. We don't know that. We don't have the data, we don't have the models. That's what I'm focused on. But I think there's not very many, there's a few companies focused on that. The NERC data and what we just heard about speaks exactly to this point as well, with the 10 bullet points that were outlined. It's, there's data beginning to be, I think we have an awesome amount of information and data, but it's not in a format that can be leveraged by companies that are doing software, AI or otherwise, to be able to draw interesting and important conclusions on reliability. Reliability is just, we talk about it in terms of statistics, and you can't solve hard problems with stats. You have to solve hard problems with calculus. The only way you can solve hard problems with calculus is if you have all the variables. So yeah, that's what I think is most important for tech companies, is figuring out how to do, how to get the information to solve hard problems as it relates to reliability.
Do you have any insight on that, Lucas?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The issue, I think, a lot of times, again, this goes into making data such that it can, or predictions and forecasts such that they can be made actionable by market participants. I think a large issue is due to the fact that data often lives in silos, whether it's with a grid operator or the utility or otherwise, retail supply, even with matrix rates, things like that. So there's no centralized application programming interface. There's no good ways, there's no good interdepartmental software communication. So those kinds of things are real barriers to entry when you really want to get going in terms of making something actionable. That's actually the engineering part's actually pretty easy. It's getting the data and making sure it's reliable data, because your forecast is only good as your data. And it's funny because it sounds like with say load balancing, for instance, it sounds like an easy problem. Well, have the net total of the meters equate to what the demand is, and then balance it with generation. But of course, that's not the fact, because again, these data sources live in silos, so it's difficult to get to them.
Yeah, maybe one thing I'd comment on as well is, look, I think the folks in this room have done an incredible job at accelerating the adoption of technology. I'd say the amount of I guess excitement and encouragement of new technology and the barrier to entry in the energy sector with EPSA members is probably the highest that I've seen of any industry I've worked in: manufacturing, oil and gas, government, et cetera. But I think procuring software is just not a thing that is very common, or it's very clear how to do, both for how to price it in a way that would be accepted by companies on the tech side, or on the company side. What kind of models make sense? Like SaaS is a really bad word in the energy sector, which makes it really hard for investors to invest into. But software as a service is trying to figure out how do you create outcome-based pricing in a way that can make sense for both parties. And I think rightly so, there's been pushback by the energy sector, but I think the speed of adopting and the changing of the mentalities around buying software and leveraging it must change if we want to see the stat I told you before about disparate data being useful to drive data-driven decisions, and playing with calculus instead of stats. We've got to move away from this, I love my friends at McKinsey, but we got to move away from this consultant-based decision-making to more data-driven decision-making that can be improved and informed across many different power plants, for example. We're doing very similar things at each power plant. We should be learning from each facility and the data we're gathering from each facility every day to improve the efficiency, the reliability, the sustainability, and the availability of our power assets.
Shawn, if you have some input on that, that would be great. But
no, I think both of my panelists up here kind of hit the point, but it is that balance. You have to deliver, because if you make a mistake, bad things happen, right? And so it's sad that in a lot of things that I explain, it all goes back to the movie Hitch, which is a horrible movie. But there's a lot to be said in the interaction between Kevin James and Will Smith, where he's like, you're doing all this, and you got to stay here. And when you think about competitive markets and you think about power generation, stay here. Do what you know, and don't go out there. And politicians, Congress, administrations, and so forth, they like to live out here. And there's a purpose to delivery, and there's a purpose to reliability that everyone in this room has to meet. And it is focusing on what you know and what you can deliver, and that's what matters.
okay, well, there's quite a few questions that have come in. I'm going to get through them because we have plenty more to talk about. But I think keeping what we know now and how we are dealing with our issues with solutions that exist today. So Jake, there's a question for you. How do you and Gecko's technology help extend the life to improve performance of existing resources? The performance question is important.
Yeah, great. So Gecko, what the suite of robots do is we deploy them at, whether it be an aircraft carrier, a power plant boiler, a tank, a pipeline, the Hoover Dam, a long list of built things. The robots are collecting structural integrity data using a bunch of different sensors, ultrasonics, visual, thermal, et cetera. We have drones that we deploy as well, but what we're aiming at doing is gathering this critical information on the structural integrity and performance of critical assets, let's say at a power plant, and transforming the world of atoms into a world of bits is what I typically talk about. And once you've created the data lake, then you have to ensure that with context you create the right algorithms to produce the results that you desire. For example, when will things fail based on the hundreds of thousands of assets that we've done work on, or the hundreds or thousands of assets that are similar to the asset that we're looking at? What has gone wrong from a root cause analysis to create a rupture in a pressure vessel, for example? When will that occur at the asset that we're looking at? How do you plan and predict and prudently make repairs, especially if you can utilize different budgets than OpEx? That's key, especially on the utility side. Our customers use CapEx, for example, for the repairs and for paying for our products. But it's all about, in 2 years we took one of the largest coal power plant, for example, in the U.S. From, I think it was like 16 forced outages per year to 0. But it's just, you can collect the information, you can put it into the interface, digitize it, put it into an interface that can drive decisions at the facility level, but then also help an executive or an asset owner across a fleet understand the impact of being able to predict and prevent, being able to ensure that when called upon, this asset will work instead of fail and at peak loads. That's been like the critical case. So it's on the government side, it's all about mission readiness, uptime, that kind of stuff. Yeah, so hopefully that answers the question.
I think, and also, Lucas, we have some questions about the data you actually analyze through AI. What kind of data are you actually analyzing as it pertains to reliability? And then the second question is about data privacy and how it's going to affect what kind of data is collected and how it's used for forecasting, but
Sure.
What are the implications of data privacy?
Sure. So I kind of alluded to it a little bit previously, but most of it's going to be your locational marginal pricing. And as it pertains to reliability, again, this is going to be for our product suite that's directed at helping balancing authorities and generators optimally bid into real-time markets. So very spot market oriented. So again, you're looking at locational marginal pricing, congestion, marginal loss. I'd love to get more. Again, this goes into the difficulty of getting data. We're looking into getting data from utilities on. It's user agnostic, and because these neural networks are black boxes, you can essentially use them and not rebroadcast these indexes. Which actually in some cases is the only way you can get access to this data, because otherwise you have to be a market participant of certain credential or a trade desk or otherwise. But if you use them in the black box that is AI, the interconnections aren't exactly that well known, so you don't rebroadcast those. It's kind of a way around that. But yeah, that's primarily I guess you could call it the data mix. Again, weather, wind speeds, winds that I think Todd alluded to, wind being very predictable now. That's true. So that's a great index. We wish that solar forecasts for being able to see what the luminosity on a certain day is going to be. Once that gets better, that'll be really good, especially if you're looking out about a week. But that's the primary data mix.
And the privacy do you think, has implications?
Yeah, if you're getting it through an API from, let's say, user data from the utility, you're really only looking at you're trying to get a glimpse of what the overall demand is, and then you tie that with what the demand indexes that come from the ISO. But it's a little bit more real time. That's another big issue is if you're trying to make a forecasting algorithm that's actionable to within 5 minutes, you need extremely low latency data. You need to be, I love that atoms to bits, that's awesome. That's essentially what we need is for, if it transmits or consumes electricity, meter it, have sensors on it, because in 20 years, I see probably a very automated grid. The Internet of Things combined with smart appliances, and then you mix that with an actual grid that can respond very quickly and reliably to demand, both from forecasting and prediction, and then just knowing in real time what's happening. Transmit data as you transmit electrons, and that's going to solve a lot of the problems, I think.
We have a question here about timeline. Okay, what is the realistic timeline, for example, for the adoption of CCUS, carbon capture, data-driven operations and maintenance, and other technologies that are making an impact, or poised to make an impact? Some of these digitalized technologies, even when we talk about, for example, artificial intelligence and the solutions that come with it, they're still futuristic because of the constraints we have with our legacy systems, for example. So what is the time? Maybe I'll ask you a quick question that in a flash format. How do you see it playing out?
Your guess is as good as mine, right?
Yes.
And that is, it's a great question, right? And it kind of goes back to my kind of analogy earlier about George Bush standing in front of the aircraft carrier. Everybody has to start making the investments now. It is not a tomorrow solution. It is several years down the line. I would say, those who are not looking at government funding for whatever reasons should start looking at that, because ultimately it's going to be here quicker than you think, but it's going to take time. I think we have very aspirational goals for net zero or whatever timeline we want to go down. And there becomes an issue of almost paralyzed from wanting to invest. Are we too late to invest? Should I just retire? All these things start coming into play. And I would say, there is a recognition from the Department of Energy and a lot of others that if you start making the investments now and you start thinking about it, ultimately it will all come together. But if you kind of do a scenario where you kind of put your head in the sand and pretend like somebody else is going to answer the questions for you, you're already done. And you just have to start, even though it's uncomfortable, look at these solutions and realize that if you do this, in that 10, 15, 20-year time horizon, you're going to be able to make it. But if you sit there and ignore it, and again, I'm not saying don't focus on this. No, focus on what you know and be able to deliver. You're going to be okay. And I think a lot of people, again, I don't blame them. I don't blame anyone who is concerned about, am I too late? What if I mess up? Whatever happens. But that's what government funding is for, because I think everybody recognizes that while we have aspirational goals, you have to start making these investments now, because nobody really knows as much as they want to tell you that they do.
I might disagree a little bit with the push for looking at government funding as like the primary source. Reason being is the amount of startups I've seen die from doing that has been like 30 or so, just because of the pace it takes for the government to approve things or how much they approve.
I don't disagree with that, yes.
Yeah. But I think like for some of the products that you're leading and working on, like, make complete sense. That needs to be initiatives. Ideally, it's not, though. Ideally, there's more, there's more of a there's more of an acceleration from the private sector to invest, because I think that also like it creates the right kind of competition opposed to maybe the inverse of that. On our side, at least, last year we have data on 25% of, we work in a lot of different industries, but 25% of the coal facilities we have data on. We were in last year, 25% of all coal facilities in the U.S. So it's happening now. It's happening fast, and the 75% needs to catch up because they're not reaping the benefits of it. And I can tell you the data we've collected on those 25%, we have information that, for example, NERC does not have because we collect 100,000 times more data than typically you do when you look at a boiler, for example. And I can tell you that 40% of the facilities that we looked at, that 25%, will experience at least one pretty major outage in the next 3 to 12 months. So I think like it's happening now.
40%?
That's right. It's information. We have this information that.
It is substantial.
Well, if you extrapolate across the reliance of coal in the U.S., I mean that's like 32 million megawatts, or something like that.
Okay.
Wow. Yeah.
Thanks, Jake, and now I'm scared.
Yeah. Well, reliability is important. Yeah.
Lucas, first you have forecasts and you have the data. So do you have a timeline for adoption? Guess.
Yeah, I mean, optimally, I'd love to see it within the next 5 years, mass adoption. If you look at, again, other industries, it's fascinating. I don't know if anybody here is following like just the craziness that's happening with AI art, ChatGPT, natural language models. It's incredible. There are use cases there that are understandable to the masses, and that's why they're quickly adopted. But if you look at the rate of progression, it's just incredible. I mean, the latest version of GPT-4, is an order of magnitude greater in its reasoning capabilities than 3.5. I think it took the LSAT blind, and yeah, it was incredible. I mean, that's incredible. So I think if we see the same kind of adoption in energy, and we see how robust these kinds of technologies can be, it's going to scale extremely quickly, and there's going to be a lot more adoption. It'll happen a lot quicker. So hopefully, long answer short, 5 years.
One question here is about AI's role in accounting to adequately manage emissions, because emissions is going to be where it is. I know there's some digital technologies already looking at them, but how do you see the rollout of real-time monitoring for non-dispatchable resources and stuff like that with artificial intelligence and data refinement?
That's interesting. I mean, it's not a use case we've looked into, but that goes into, again, atoms to bits. I love that. I hope that isn't copyrighted. So the creation of digital twins, again, for anything, and every physical component, every consumer, and every generator. That just goes back into that. As many things as you can have turn into the matrix, we're going to be looking at a much better forecasting ability.
Yeah, I think EPRI's focusing pretty hard on net zero industrial clusters. This is a thing that at the World Economic Forum in January, it was a pretty large topic around how do you measure decrease to net zero in the thermal, especially in thermal. I mean, the thing is, we've spent $3.8 trillion to go from 82% reliance on fossil for energy to 81% over the last 10 years. And most likely it'll probably begin to creep back up to 82%. And I think like the key is like, we need to augment and build new technology, hydrogen, wind, solar, et cetera. But I think it should communicate like there's a long way to go. And so the biggest impact in my lifetime, at least, is going to be on how do you reduce the emissions in fossil-reliant industries. And so you can do that by eliminating outages and forced shutdowns, for example. It's like a pretty large one. You can do that by You can do that by, you can do that by putting more money into scrubbing bad emissions from facilities. I mean, this is a big problem internationally. The regulations on SDAs is like really bad internationally. But yeah, I think like there's more technology and investment that needs to go into how do you make fuels that are perceived dirty cleaner. I don't know why there is a resistance to talk about that and invest in that. It makes no sense, and it's really stupid.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask the last question. I want a really quick answer, if you can, please. Or just one, what is the biggest factor that has led to the lack of adoption in the power sector of today's, or of available technology? Very quickly, please.
Very quickly. All right. Cost and regulation, right? You have to make it make sense, and you have to make it easy enough for me to want to do it.
Right. Lucas?
He took my words. Yeah, essentially, I'd say that just the barriers of entry are both from an educational standpoint and then from execution are difficult, and that's across the sector. I mean, just look at the requirements on trade desks. Most people you talk to, oh, I didn't know there was that. They say the same thing. I didn't know there was that much to electricity. I turn my light on and it comes on. That's what the hot water, like you said, hot water. Was it cold? That's right. And that's kind of the extent of the knowledge for most people. So I think there's educational boundaries as well.
Yeah. Jay?
Could you repeat the question again?
The question is, what is the biggest factor that has led to the lack of adoption in the power sector of available technology?
Oh, man.
10 seconds.
Yeah, I think, like I said, we've never really experienced such a tension on our industry as ever before, and so I think we've been getting nice and fat for a while, and I think now there's a lot of attention and a lot more pressures on this sector, this critical sector. I think that pressure to change and there's more competition, there's more regulation. All these things will fuel innovation in a way that is just coming from more of just like a necessity rather than it's a nice to have. I think that's the biggest change. And I think, by the way, I know Senator Manchin pretty well. We work with his team. The Inflation Reduction Act, that is an incredible tool to accelerate this exactly. So I think the right politicians recognize this, and so I think that's it's hugely important to accelerate and also co-fund these efforts. So.
It's education again. Thank you very much to all of you. Please thank our panelists. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.